Hey there. This is going to be my first little poetry lecture from the Peckham family bunker or compound, as we all sort of, uh, navigate this emergency. So, what I thought I might do today is talk a little bit more about a concept that I think is pretty important to understanding poetry. Um, and each day that I do one of these, I'm going to try to focus on a single concept while also focusing on this larger concept of what is good writing, or sort of larger, what my former mentor of mine, Hilda Raz, used to call what is good. Um, and I think we forget oftentimes in poetry that poetry is at the very most basic sense must be simply good writing. In the end, no one really cares about genre. They care about whether or not something moves them or makes them think or makes them feel. And when a writer chooses a genre, they don't choose it because they think they want to necessarily be a poet or a fiction writer or an essayist. They just have come to the realization that this particular genre, just as an athlete chooses a sport or a musician chooses an instrument, that this particular mode, this vehicle, is the best one for them for getting at the issues and ideas and memories and stories that they want to tell. So poetry at its most basic must be good writing. That's really what I want to talk about first today, is to talk about good writing in relationship to this poem that I had you read for today, called Beauty, by Fairchild. It's B.H. Fairchild, and it's from a book of his called The Art of the Lathe. Interestingly enough, B.H. Fairchild is not, in my mind, one of my favorite poets. But this poem is undeniably a great poem, and I think one of the reasons it is a great poem is it forgets that it's a poem. It's not too worried about being a poem. It's mostly worried about exploring an idea or concept. So what makes for good writing? Well, we've talked about this a lot in class. We want charged language. We want tension. We want there to be some stakes and some consequences to it. If there are characters, we want them fully and roundly developed. If there are stories in them, we want those stories to have purpose, especially in a poem where stories are used more as more anecdotally, meaning that the stories represent a particular idea. We want the sentence structures to be complicated and interesting. We want there to be music and rhythm and flow. We want all of the same things that we would want in a short story or even an essay. If anything, we want those things to a greater extent because it's a poem. Most of the time, poems have this quality of concision, which just means that they're compressed, but they're only as short as the story or the idea that they're exploring is simple. So if you're trying to write the Iliad, of course, or the Bible, or a play by Shakespeare, that poem is going to be very, very long. Shakespeare's plays are all long poems. So is the Iliad and the Odyssey, and so is the Bible. So none of those are short, but if they were written in prose, they'd probably be 3 times longer than they already are. So we should all be blessed that they're written in poetry. Anyway, so the first thing I want you to do before I get started talking about this poem is I would like you to hit the pause button and then go to schedule and read the poem. So why don't you hit the pause button now and go to schedule and read the poem Beauty by B.H. Fairchild. There should be a link to it right on the schedule. Okay. All right. Great. So I'm going to simply read the 4th section of this poem, and then I'm going to go back and talk about this concept of dream logic, associative drifting, or associative movement in poetry that we see here. This is from section 4. So there they are, as I will always remember them, The men who were once fullbacks or tackles or guards in their three-point stances knuckling into the mud, hungry for high school glory and the pride of their fathers, eager to gallop terribly against each other's bodies, each man in his body looking out now at the nakedness of a body like his. Men who each autumn had followed their fathers into the pheasant-rich fields of Kansas, and as boys had climbed down from the Alice Chalmers after plowing their first straight furrow, licking the dirt from their lips, the hand of the father resting lightly upon their shoulder. Men who in the oven-warm winter kitchens of Baptist households saw after a bath the body of the father and felt diminished by it. Who that same winter in the abandoned schoolyard felt the odd intimacy of their fist against the larger boy's cheekbone, but kept hitting ferociously and walked away, feeling for the first time the strength, the abundance of their bodies. And I imagine the men that evening after the strangest day of their lives, after they have left the shop without speaking and made the long drive home alone in their pickups. I see them in their little white frame houses on the edge of town, adrift in the long silence of the evening, turning finally to their wives, touching, without speaking, the hair which she has learned to let fall about her shoulders at this hour of the night, lifting the white nightgown from her body as she in turn unbuttons his work shirt, heavy with the sweat and grease of the day's labor, until they stand naked before each other and begin to touch, in a slow choreography of familiar gestures, their bodies, she touching his chest, his hand brushing her breasts, and he does not say the word beautiful because he cannot and never has, and she does not say it because it would embarrass him or any other man she has ever known, though it is precisely the word I am thinking now, as I stand before Donatello's David with my wife touching my sleeve. What are you thinking? And I think of the letter from my father years ago describing the death of Bobby Sudduth, a single shot from a 12-gauge which he held against his chest, the death of the heart, I suppose, a kind of terrible beauty. As someone said of the death of Hart Crane, though that is surely a perverse use of the word, and I was stunned then, thinking of the damage men will visit upon their bodies. What are you thinking? She asks again, and so I begin to tell her about a strange afternoon in Kansas, about something I have never spoken of, and we will walk to a window where the shifting light spreads a sheen along the casement, and looking out we see the city blazing like miles of uncut wheat, the farthest buildings taken in their turn, and the great dome, the way the metal roof of the machine shop, I tell her, would break into flame late on an autumn day with such beauty. Okay, well, that, by the way, is a beautiful poem, but it's also doing a whole bunch of amazing things. Now, hopefully, you're recognizing the very precise image is that, just from the part that I read, particularly that moment between man and wife, of them touching, the details of the unbuttoning the shirt, the unbuttoning the blouse, but also the interplay between image and action and thought that's going on there. It's all incredibly well done, and you don't need to use your own imagination here, because the author successfully used telepathy to get the image that's in his head over and pass it over to you. This is just fundamentally good writing. Throughout the poem, there are incredible moments of character development as well. I think in particular, Bobby Sudduth comes across so powerfully and despicably, of course, as kind of the oppositional character to this idea of beauty. Again, a concept that we were talking about in fiction. There is the point of conflict. Bobby Sudduth, who thinks the shot that killed Kennedy by Oswald was a beauty, for example, and thinks that there's some thinks that it's appropriate to talk about molesting his sister in the middle of the poem. He's a horrible human being, and who responds to homosexuality by wanting to kill the men that were found naked in the shop. He is represented by each of those actions and by his words, both through precise imagery like his botched tattoos. All of that stuff is incredible character building. But what's most amazing about this poem is its dream logic, its drifting. We begin in Europe, and we're not really sure of the situation, except that Fairchild himself, who is the speaker, is, and let's face it, as writers, this idea of the speaker, the poet's the speaker. Unless there's a reason to believe that the poet's not the poet's the speaker. In this case, it's Fairchild, and he's thinking about this concept of beauty. And much like as you would explore an idea in an essay, moving from thought to thought, idea to idea, we see him, and this poem is in sections, moving for different examples of beauty. This also leads him into some side digressions, which is also fundamental to the essay, this idea of digressive thinking, where he starts thinking not just about beauty, but masculinity, because men are so uncomfortable with conceptions of beauty. And so we move from moment to moment, time to time. We're moving around all over the place until we finally come back to Donatello's David, which is really astonishing, and thinking about the beauty of the naked body, which makes perfect sense. And you're like, well, this is why we're thinking about the two naked men in the garage. But this is all dream logic. Instead of setting out to say, okay, this is what beauty is, and getting wedded to that initiating idea, I'm going to describe Donatello, and I'm going to describe Donatello's David, and I'm going to tell you why this is beautiful. Instead, he lets his mind move from the image of the statue back to a memory of two naked men and the situation that brought up early in his life, and then let that move into these ideas of intimacy, which is really where we end up, isn't it? Ultimately, that beauty must be connected to this conception of intimacy, but you only get there by letting go of your need for control and letting the image flow to another image, idea flow to another idea, time flow to time, letting the mind move on the page from one thing to another, instead of being wedded to one particular moment or one particular idea. This is a good idea to keep in mind as well as you revise your fiction, because so many of you are trying to tell this tight little story that stays in one moment in time. But a great way to give us context and to give us a sense for why a particular moment matters, like this moment that B.H. Fairchild is talking about, staring at Donatello's David. Not Michelangelo's David, by the way. Donatello's David, different thing. You should look it up, find a picture somewhere. But instead of staying in that particular moment, sometimes having a character flash back to a previous related moment will help us to understand why this one matters. And so many of you really need to be thinking about doing that. All right, that's the mini lecture from today. I think what I'm going to do is try to follow up these mini lectures. There will be, and actually I'll just tell you what I'm going to do. Expect today that I will post up at Writing Prompts a prompt for writing about an abstract concept that should hopefully help you with writing a poem that practices some of this associative movement. All right, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed my little mini lecture. Most of these will take about 10 minutes in time. This one took about 15. Yeah, it's just me talking to you, but my technological skills being what they are, I might order myself a whiteboard so I can show you things, but I don't know how to put things on a screen yet. If I figure that out, I'll do it. All right. Hope you're all doing well. Stay healthy. Wash your hands. Eat well. Get some exercise. Do all the good things, and hang in there. Okay. All right.